Welcome to Mike Graham's Political Punch-Up on Talk Radio TV. Today, the big question is this: should we all go vegan to save the planet? I'll give my verdict on it after we've had a spirited discussion today with our two guests, Nathan McGovern, who's an activist from Animal Rebellion, and James Chiavarini, a restaurateur and conservationist. Welcome to both of you. Thank you very much for joining us. Nathan, let me start with you. Should we go vegan to save the planet?
Well, thank you for having me on, Mike. I think the question is rather, should we have a just and sustainable food system to save the planet? I mean, all we need to do is look at the science. When the UN tells us 18 to 23% of global greenhouse gases come from the animal agriculture sector, more than the entirety of transport put together, we need to seriously reconsider where our food is coming from, and that food should be coming from plant-based sources.
So, James, is it all about how big the manufacturing is, or is it all about the kind of thing you're putting into your mouth?
So the first thing I would say to that is that the industrial food chain is terrible for us as human beings and terrible for the environment. The problem with that is that the industrial food chain compromises meat, dairy and arable and plant-based. So what you really need to be doing is forgetting buying in cheap meat from overseas and basically concentrating exclusively on sustainable, carbon-sequestered beef and lamb from this country where it's much more ethically sourced.
And Nathan, so would that be something that you would ever entertain? Because obviously, being in Animal Rebellion, presumably you believe that we shouldn't eat meat at all.
Well, absolutely not. I would say to your argument about the carbon sequestering, Oxford's 2017 study revealed that using livestock to manage carbon sequestering is actually ineffective. Also, when we talk about sheep...
what is carbon sequestering?
Sorry, the ability for the ground to actually absorb carbon from the atmosphere that some people believe animals turning over the soil, etc., can contribute towards. But as I say, an Oxford 2017 study shows that is very ineffective.
So I've got two friends of mine who are arable mixed-use farmers, both of which practice regenerative agriculture. Both of them have had their farm carbon audited and they both came out carbon negative. The only reason why they came out carbon negative is because of fertiliser that they put into the ground to regenerate the soil. That fertiliser can either come from two forms. It can either be used like it is in the plant-based foods with fossil fuel-based, which is no good for the environment, or it can come from a natural source of cows and sheep. And especially with cows and sheep, what really happens is that what you need is the gut bacteria from the ruminant animals to enrich the soil. The problem they have is if you take away that livestock to enrich the soil with fertiliser, how are you going to make that soil better to sequester the carbon?
Well, there's nothing to say that we can't have animals. It's just the fact that if you look at the data, right, those animals, when we're using them for livestock, are producing horrific amounts of greenhouse gases. Horrific amounts.
OK, so according to the DEFRA figures of 2019, the agriculture sector, including arable and plant-based, contributed 10% of all the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. From that 10%, when you take into effect carbon sequestration from livestock, methane drops down to 4.9%. So it's actually the minority. The biggest problem that you have, apart from methane, is nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide, again, from fossil fuel-based fertilisers, is the only alternative, realistically, commercially, to natural animal-based fertilisers. Now, to your point that you want to keep the animals, but you just don't want to eat them, that's fine. So what's going to happen to them? What's going to happen
when you end up with loads of animals running around that weren't being sort of, destroyed, for want of a better word, or who were living longer lives, and therefore, there'd be more of them?
So I think we're dodging the question here. I think the question really is, do you know how much of the UK's land footprint is associated with animal agriculture? Can you give me that figure off the top of your head?
So what I can tell you is that 65% of our land is better suited to grazing than it is to arable production.
No, can you answer my question? Do you know how much of the UK's land footprint is associated with animal agriculture?
No.
85%.
And does that mean the amount of land which is occupied by animals?
But a lot of that land can't be used for anything else. So like our uplands.
A lot of that land could be used for rewilding. That shows that we can absorb more carbon by rewilding if we adopt plant-based eating, if we adopt plant-based food.
So are you saying there's too much space being taken up by animals? Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is our current food system, right, is unsuited to actually feeding our population and keeping carbon emissions down. When we have 85% of our land taken up by things like meat, dairy, eggs, only producing 48% of our protein and 32% of our calories, we have to look at that, especially when we consider the emissions coming from that.
But when 65% of the land is unsuitable for anything other than grazing, then what choice have you got?
I've already answered that question. We can rewild land.
Please, I'll let you finish it. Please let me finish. You talked about rewilding. How is rewilding going to sequester carbon?
OK, so when we plant trees, other plants that maybe we can't eat, those can grow, they can turn into their own ecosystems, right?
Okay.
They can absorb carbon rather than having, ruminants, your sheep, your beef, just pumping methane into the
Okay,
atmosphere.
but we know that the best way to sequester carbon isn't from forests, it's from prairie grasslands. We know that the best forms of soils, molly soils particularly, are found under native prairie grass. So we know that grasslands sequester more carbon than forestry. And for grasslands to work, you need ruminant animals to keep the ground fertilised. How are you going to keep
Can
the
I just
ground
interrupt both
fertilised?
of you here? Because both of you seem to be talking about two different things, right? And what we need here is common sense, because we are, of course, the home of common sense. And what I'm hearing from you, Nathan, is that you're talking about a completely different sort of environment, I suppose, that we would all live in, which might be something that a lot of people would want. But you also have to feed people. You also have to think about the other big problem. I know this is not part of the argument, but an awful lot of people think we should be building more housing in this country so that more people can have affordable housing. So surely if you were going to reclaim some of the land that's currently being used by animals, you'd want to use some of that land to build on, wouldn't you?
Affordable housing is a different debate. I mean, our government showed we don't have a housing crisis. Our government showed during COVID we don't have a housing crisis when they could overnight rehome every homeless person in the country. I think you're asking a different question, and I think what you're relying on is incorrect sources. I mean, we could home everyone in this country. COVID showed that.
Well, no, we can't home everyone in this country endlessly because you can't sustain it financially. You can't just continue to give people places to live for no money whatsoever. But what you could do, if you're going to reclaim some of the land, is all I'm saying, is you could build housing that people can afford. You're always going to have homeless people. I mean, every country in the world has homeless people. It doesn't matter, which country it is. The point is that if we are going to try and make the argument about whether veganism will save the planet or whether not going vegan will not save the planet, I think that's the question I really would like to see you answering over the next 30 seconds.
Well, absolutely. I mean, veganism, making it about personal choice, is one way to go about it. But when you look at institutions, for example, DEFRA, they invest £1.5 billion of our taxpayer money every year into animal agriculture. Most of that doesn't turn a profit before the government starts giving them our money. If you look at other sources, your fruit and veg that are receiving subsidies, only about 10% of their profit is coming out of the taxpayer's pocket, compared to 90% for grass-fed beef in this country.
So you're saying there should be better subsidies for non-grass-fed, non-meat foodstuffs?
What I'm saying is that farmers should be helped to transition to producing food for a plant-based food system. They should be helped by the taxpayer rather than being forced into ruminants, your sheep, your beef. They should be helped to transition away from that.
But if James is right,
that's actually going to give us.
But if James is right that most of the land that is being currently used for animal grazing is only good for animal grazing, then how much of that is going to change?
Well, the simple fact of the matter is we don't need the amount of land we have for animal agriculture if we transition to plant-based sources, right? It's very, very inefficient to produce, especially grass-fed beef.
How are you going to fertilise the ground without animals? For your plot, so you can grow. So say you want to have an arable production. Say for example, my friend Tom, who's got a mixed arable land in mid Suffolk. He's an excellent farmer, and his farm is carbon negative. He has livestock on his land in order to re-fertilise the soil after he's grown his plants. Once you take that livestock off, how are you going to enrich the soil so you can plant again? So if you only want to have plants, once you've done your crop, and it's taken all the nutrients out of the soil, how are you going to put the nutrients back into the soil so that you can grow your plants a second time?
We have biofuels. We have natural fertilisers. I know.
What natural fertiliser meaning what? Cow poo?
Not necessarily, no.
So what other choices have you got?
The decayed remnants of plant matter, so on. The decayed remnants.
I don't think that's commercially sustainable. Let's be honest. You've basically got realistically, what's being used is fossil fuel-based fertilisers. That's what's realistically being used by arable farmers at the moment, which just contributes massively to nitrous oxide, one of the 3 most poisonous greenhouse gases that UK admit. So the answer really is to have a mixed-use, low-impact system that benefits everything. But for that to happen, you need livestock. Livestock are one of the 5 pillars of regenerative agriculture in this country. You can't have a system that without them, it just doesn't make any sense. We've evolved hand in glove, humans and livestock together to create the landscape that we all inhabit now.
Final question to you, Nathan. If, in fact, every farm that had animals on it was like his friend's farm and it was carbon negative, would that be right?
Absolutely not. The data shows that can only be effective in the short term. This isn't me telling you this. This is the University of Oxford telling you.
Why can't it be effective in the long term?
All right. Do you want the full explanation? You told me 30 seconds.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, we were a very quick show, so you need to do it quickly. And the thing about what we try to do, I mean, I haven't understood half of what you've said, which is not because I'm an idiot. although some people think I am. It's because it's very technical. And I think for most people watching and listening to this, they'll want an answer from you, which is kind of something they can understand. And you're using a lot of terms which I don't think many people know much about.
Right, there's a limit to the amount of nutrients an animal can turn over in the soil. And there is a time delay on that. It's a short-term option, but it's not going to be sustainable in the long term. It only turns it over for a certain amount of time. And then once
it's not about turning over. It's not about turning over. It's about refertilizing the soil with manure,
which is being turned over from the soil. Yeah.
Okay, so hang on a minute. You can have no-till, no ploughing systems. Now, the other problem that you've got is that when you plough and you till for arable, what are you doing? You're then turning over the soil and you're releasing the carbon back in. What you need to do is you need to emulate the systems like they have in the prairies in America, where you basically have herds of migratory animals coming in intensive grazing and then intensive rest and then intensive rejuvenation of the soil through manure. We know this. This is scientific facts. I'm not here to stick up for industrial agriculture. I abhor industrial agriculture as much as you do. But the reality, if you think that veganism is going to save the planet, it's entirely erroneous. If you look at what Lord Debon said, who's the chairman of the government's climate change committee, he said, and I quote, what did he say? Veganism is the opponent of climate change activism. Now, if you want to be vegan because you believe in animal welfare and you believe in animal rights and you want to live a no-slaughter life, that's a totally different argument to the environmental argument. The environmental argument needs animals and invertebrates and plants living and humans coexisting together in a way that actually benefits everybody, not just benefits one group of people.
And isn't that the reasonable way to go forward, so that everybody has a part of it, rather than just saying only one lot of people should have a part of it?
The reasonable thing going forward is listening to the Chatham House report, right? The Chatham House report that told us in 2021 that plant-based eating is an individual's single biggest positive impact on the environment, right? And if you extrapolate that and we talk about a plant-based food system, a just and sustainable plant-based food system, the impact that could have on the environment is incredible.
If you take into account industrial farming, which is the problem. And industrial farming happens in the plant-based world too. So let's look at some of the plant-based alternatives that people have got, right? Let's say, for example...
You're not going to tell me McDonald's are making plant-based food in a sustainable and nice way, are they?
I would be very surprised. I would be very surprised if they are. But I mean, let's take, for example, like this. Let's take, for example, like dairy-based alternatives. Look at Oatly. So you buy Oatly thinking that you're helping the planet, right? Because it's non-dairy. Therefore, you think, okay, I'm doing my bit to help the planet by buying Oatly. Oatly is owned by China Resources and Blackstone. The other part of China Resources' business is building fossil fuel coal power stations in China. So that's not particularly helpful. Blackstone CEO Stephen Schwarzman was the biggest donor to Donald Trump's presidential campaign and got on board with the message that climate change is a Chinese-inspired hoax. Okay? And this is leaving aside these strong allegations that Blackstone has been involved in deforestation of the Amazon. So that's where your money goes.
So they're doing it for business purposes?
Of course they're doing it for business purposes. All of these companies are doing it for business purposes.
They're doing it for business purposes, but they're making things better. I just think it's impossible.
No, I wouldn't say that at all.
Wouldn't you?
I wouldn't say that at all.
Oh, okay. So you would be against...
I'd say
you would be against what they're doing.
Just and sustainable plant-based options, right, are our future. Okay, let's look.
So do you think Beyond Meat? Do you think Beyond
Meat
Meat's sustainable?
We'll give you one final statement because you've said quite a lot. So give us your final statement.
All right, 100 grams of protein from beef produces about 50 kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions.
What kind of beef? Grass-fed or
Can I finish my point? That's the median for all beef production.
Okay.
The same amount of protein from tofu is less than 5, so that's 10 times less.
Tofu is horrible.
What about...
If we're talking about dairy, the median for 1 litre of milk, 3 kilograms CO2 equivalent emissions. For soy milk, less than 1.
Okay.
But people have to make that choice, don't they? You can't make them do that, really. So...
if you want to talk about that, I've already told you our government pumps £1.5 billion of taxpayer money into those
what
industries
I'm saying
a year.
is people, first of all, have to want to eat tofu. And, I mean, I don't have a problem eating vegetarian food from time to time, but I just don't like tofu. Nothing you say is going to make me eat it. So... I'm never going to change that habit of mine not to eat tofu. So unless somebody comes up with something which is better than that, then it's a bit like electric cars. If they make them cheaper, people will drive them. If they make them more expensive, you can't afford them.
Well, then you're agreeing with me, aren't you? When I'm telling you...
Well, no, I'm not, because I don't believe in government subsidy towards much, really. I think people should be able to make a free choice based on whatever the market value is of something. And I don't want to push everybody into doing one thing rather than another, just because some people want that to happen. I love that look. He's giving me that look. Anyway, listen, guys, it was great. Thank you very much indeed. It's almost impossible to make a judgment, actually, on whether or not veganism would save the planet. But I'm going to make the judgment, and this is when you're going to hear the bell. I think you both made great arguments, and actually I think it's unclear now to me whether or not veganism would save the planet. But I think what we need to do is think more about maybe some kind of mixed form of... some of the points you made were very good about the government subsidising the wrong kinds of things. It doesn't surprise me the government gets quite a lot of stuff wrong. But I think I'm going to have to say at the moment, until such time as I become convinced otherwise, that I don't think changing to veganism is going to save the planet. So, which means James Chiavarini wins with 1 point, and Nathan wins nothing with no points. But thank you so much for both of you coming in. Hopefully it's made you think about it. This is a political punch-up. We'll have another one next week.